Now that we have our x-axis and our data binding to go with that axis, we can build on our existing code for our x-axis component and extend it to make a y-axis. Let's dive right into our code editor, and here we're running our npm dev script. If we go to our main app file, here's where we are inserting the x-axis. So let's go ahead and just duplicate that line, and we'll add some code in here to make it distinct from the x-axis. The way we're going to do that is add a prop here for our axis, and since we want our y-axis to be rotated 90 degrees from the x-axis, we're going to say rotate equals true. If we then go back into our axis component, we can add that prop in right here. And we'll give this a type of Boolean and a default value of false. Now we can edit our class on our main axis container here. And this is a Vue class binding that will add a class of rotate to our component if the rotate prop is set to true. So just to distinguish between these two, we could call this rotate prop value, and then this down here would need to be rotate prop value. And the name of the class being applied here is rotate. Now in this case, we would also need to go back into our app and change this to rotate prop value. But we're not going to leave it that way. I just wanted to show what the different meanings of the word rotate were in that situation. Now if we wanted to take this a step further, we could use ES6 object shorthand syntax, and this will give us the same effect as rotate, rotate. So we'll leave it that way. That looks nice and simple. And now we need to scroll down and update the CSS values to account for what happens when a class of rotate is present. I notice that I'm not using Sass here, so I'm going to go ahead and add a lang equals SCSS attribute to this style tag. And now I can add the rotate class down here. So this will target anything with a class of access container which also has a class of rotate, and that's exactly what we want. Despite the class name of rotate, we're not literally going to rotate the div in the sense of a CSS transformation. We're just going to mock this up as a div with a width of 1 and a height of 100%. And we should be centered on the screen because we're inheriting these other styles here, which we already have on our axis component. So let's see what this gives us so far. Okay, this is looking good. And since this ran right over our tick mark, let's go ahead and remove our tick mark from our axis component for the time being. I do want to correct one thing in our tick mark before we leave it behind and forget about it. Like we did with our rotated axis, let's give this a width of 1 pixel and take away the border, since that does feel a little bit hacky. And going back into our axis component, let's go ahead and remove this components property altogether for now. And looking back in the browser, let's see what else we can fix right away. We do have an X label which is on our y-axis, so we definitely need to fix that so that the x-axis has a label of X and the y-axis has a label of Y. So let's find in our code where we're adding the label in, and that's going to be right here. And we can leave the template variable exactly as it is. What we want to do is handle this not as a data property of our component, but as a computed property. So we can get rid of our data property altogether, and we'll re-add that if we need it later. For now, let's just say that the label should be given by the status of whether or not we have the rotate prop set on this component. So we're using a ternary expression to say that the label should be Y if the rotate prop is set, and it should be X otherwise. And if we save that and jump back over, great, we now have a Y here as our Y-axis label. And let's give this Y-axis label just a little bit of room. If we inspect what's going on there, we've got the right property being set to 0. And let's see, if we bump this up just a little bit, then that looks pretty good there. And this is also giving our X label a little bit of breathing room as well. So it's important to note that this particular style is affecting both labels. So let's go ahead and make that adjustment. That's going to be all the way down here at the bottom of our styles. And we'll just say that right should be 4 pixels. Now we need to improve one certain thing about our styles which we haven't talked about yet, and that is the idea of scoping our styles to our components. Right now we have a CSS rule for the label element, and this is actually going to affect every single label within our app. Just to demonstrate, let's go into our point component, and we don't have this yet, but let's say that our points have a label here. And let's just say that our label should be point label. If I save this and go back into my axis component, let's do something super obvious like make the color of these purple. And when we save that and go back into the browser, we'll see that sure enough, we have a purple label for our point and for both of our axes, even though we only put the one purple rule within our axis component. So the way that we can fix this is to go back to our style tag and to just add the keyword scoped here to our style tag. And this will make it so that our color purple on our label attribute is only scoped to our axis component. So if we return to our browser now, we'll see that sure enough, our axes have purple labels, but our point is not affected by this style rule, even though it is a very general style rule that in normal cases would apply to all labels. So make sure as you're building out your Vue components to be aware of how scoping is working with your app's CSS and SCSS. So we'll go ahead and remove our purple label example. And we want to make sure that all our components have this scoped keyword while we're at it. While scoping is great, it's probably important to understand how to create some global styles that all components will obey, and so we'll look at this a little bit later down the road when our app gets more complex style-wise. And the last thing we want to do is just go back into our point component and remove this example label here. And next, let's recall how our data binding was working here with our x-axis. We want to make it so that essentially there's another input right here, and that input will control the point's movement in the up and down direction or respective to the y-axis. So to start, let's go back into our main app.vue file, and let's scroll up and just add another input here. And makes sense to me, we should just call this y value instead of x value. And our point is going to get another prop passed in. Let's just call that y. Seems to make sense. And we'll say that its value should be y value. So that will bind the prop of this component to the value of this input here. And then I just need to add my default value. So let's just make it start at 0 like the x value does. And that's all we need to do within our app component. And since we added a y prop to our point component here, we need to go ahead and add that in our actual point.vue file. And this will be as straightforward as just copying our x prop and pasting it right here and renaming it to y. Now we haven't added any CSS rules to make our point move up and down yet, but let's go ahead to the browser since we've changed several things, and let's make sure that we're not breaking anything. Okay, we can see we've got our 2 inputs here as opposed to just 1, and if we go into our Vue Dev Tools, let's see what's going on with our point here. Okay, perfect. It looks like we do have an X and a Y now, and they're both set equal to 0, which makes sense since both of our inputs here are 0. If we change our X, let's make sure that that still works like it used to. Okay, so we see it changing value down here, and we can see the point moving back and forth as we do that. So this is a good indication we haven't broken anything or introduced any bugs by adding our new Y prop. And if we change the input that's representing our Y prop, let's see if it changes this Y value down here. And sure enough, we have it updating the Y value. Now again, it's not moving the point up and down, but we're going to add some CSS rules to make that happen next. Before we do that though, let's head back into our main app component and let's just add a little bit more clarity as far as which input is standing for which variable. Okay, great. So that will make it a little more obvious as far as which input is which. And there we go. That looks better. Now, as far as our Y coordinate goes and having that update the position of the point up and down, let's revisit our point component and look how we were changing the X value back and forth first. Recall that we used a computed property in order to handle a value that we called XCSS. So it makes sense that we might want to make another computed property called YCSS. And let's go ahead and just copy this line of code here as well as the to do because that applies here as well. But instead of this dot X, we want this to say this dot Y. And then in our template, recall that this was used here, the X CSS value was being applied to the right CSS property. So we'll add in here that the top CSS property should be Y CSS, and let's see how that's looking here. Okay, so something is definitely off here. Let's go revisit our code and see what might be causing this. Now there's nothing in our computed property that strikes me as off, although I will say that we want to change this to height because it's actually the height of the point in this case that's going to need to be adjusted for when we're talking about the Y value. And that'll maybe help us later on when we're rereading these comments and trying to figure out what they're here for. Now if we scroll down to our styles, recall that we have still top 0 and bottom 0 and margin auto, but now that we have Y given to us by data binding, we can actually just let that data binding be in control and we can remove all of these styles here. And we still are going to need the position absolute so that the right and the top properties can do what they need to do. Okay, so let's save this and go back to our browser. And cool, we're right here in the center. And if I want to change the Y value now, let's see. All right, so that's working like we thought it should. And let's see if we do a combination of X and Y. Yeah, we'll see that we can move all around the plane here in both directions. And that's exactly what we wanted. So this is a great milestone to arrive at in our project, but we still have quite a ways to go as far as making it easier to add multiple points and make the different things about the plane configurable, such as the point size, the axis size, and so on. And we also might want to consider what would it look like to have Y be dependent on X so that as we change our X, that would make it go up or down depending on what X is. And this is getting at the idea of mathematical functions and drawing curves in the plane, which is an important part of what we want to be able to do with this project.